Thanks, Harvey, for helping him out.
All right, welcome to our New York Giants Preservation Society meeting for today, Thursday, November 11th. We are very fortunate tonight to have Professor Adrian Burgos from the University of Illinois. I will get back to him in a second, but for any of those who are veterans, today's Veterans Day, so thank you for your service. My son-in-law, who is deployed, is heading home, so looking forward to seeing him. A couple of items of note. One of our members passed away last night, Ed Lucas. Ed was a speaker at one of our meetings in Berginos, and if you don't know his story,
I know his story.
It's an amazing story. He was blind, and the last thing basically that he saw was Bobby Thompson's shot heard around the world. Went outside to play baseball, got hit right between the eyes, lost his eyesight. But instead of belaboring that, he went on to become a well-known writer and basically worked for the Yankees for years. A huge Giant fan. One of his friends reached out to me looking for a way to get a New York Giant hat, so I sent him some links. He wants to be buried in that. So, Jerry Leibowitz, also a member. He has a huge collection of Giant memorabilia. He's downsizing, not nearly the size of Rick Swiggs, but huge nonetheless, and it's being auctioned off. I will send out a link if anybody's interested in purchasing any of his stuff or actually just looking at it. So next week we have the Renaissance man coming back. A lot of you never heard him speak. Mo Resner, who is about 90 years old, done everything. He filmed the last game at the Polo Grounds that the New York Giants ever played in. Made a DVD out of it, End of an Era. It's a great video. He also has been on, I forgot that movie channel, but
Turner Classic Movies?
That's it, yeah. And he wrote Ginger Rogers. I think he wrote a letter to her. He answered back. He's got these great stories, and he's a good guy. He thinks he's a Borchfeld comic still, but you'll get to see him next week. Then we'll take a break for Thanksgiving, and we come back with Corey Bush, who is Bob Lurie's right-hand man in San Francisco. Norm, I'm sure you'll be able to ask some great questions about the stick, which I know you love. So, all right, let's get on with tonight. Tonight, it is my privilege to introduce Adrian Burgos. He is just a professor at Illinois who is an author about Latino studies, and he's written 2 books. One's called Playing America's Game, and the other is called Cuban Star, and they both have to do with the New York Giants and the San Francisco Giants. There it is, Bill. Thank you. You know, with the names of Lou and Marichal and Pagan and Alex Pompez, and he is an authority of it. I tracked him down, this summer, and I really tried to get in touch with him because Alex Pompez's name has come up so often that I think many of us don't really know about him enough, and Adrian's going to fill us in with that. So, Adrian, it's our pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on tonight. I will hit the share screen. I don't know what you do at your end, but I guess, do I hit just share, or you already
hit share? You go under participants, and
okay,
you would hit share screen, so that will enable us to do that.
Because you know what happened? This thing changed. Oh
wait, you're doing it. So
can you do it now?
No. Well, let me see. You're sharing your screen, so
okay,
we don't want that.
Let me hit stop share. Okay.
Let me try to go ahead.
Is it on security maybe?
If you go under participants,
yeah,
It should have a button to say enable participants to share screen.
All right. No. All right. Let me try security. I think it's
Yeah, try security. It might be there
That's
too.
it. Share screen.
There you go.
Yep. I think you're good.
Yep.
Perfect.
All
Yahoo.
right. So let me so thank you, Gary, for the invite and for, as you noted, tracking me down. I appreciate the persistence because you got it done. Thank you, everyone else, for sharing your Thursday evening on Veterans Day. I always feel odd on Veterans Day because I served a couple of years, but I don't quite feel like, everyone ought to be thanking me for my service when so many gave so much more than I did. So for those of you who did serve, thank you. And
Thank you too.
and let's talk about making Cubans giants. So what I wanted to do is kind of give an overview of the work I've done on Alex Pompez and to understand how his story, starting from the Negro Leagues through his times with the Giants, really led to the transformation of baseball. That's part of the reason why in writing Cuban Star, the subtitle is, how one man changed the face of baseball. And I think Alex Pompez was, in fact, that kind of figure in really helping us to look at baseball from a whole different perspective. I started doing research on Pompez when I was in graduate school. And what fascinated me about his story is that as I was going through the New York Age, the Amsterdam News, other Black newspapers, is that I would find him on the front page, Numbers King. I would find him in the sports section, Black baseball entrepreneur, running other games, helping to book games. And then I would also find him in the social pages. And I was like, this is a fascinating guy. What is his story? And so that's what inspired me to go ahead and do a book, write a life story of Alex Pompez. So this cover shot slide provides 3 images of Pompez at 3 different moments. From very early on, the first image is from the 1923 Negro League World Series, which he helped to organize. He was one of those people that negotiated it. The middle image, and importantly, the person to Pompez's extreme right is Horacio Martinez, who would also be a very important figure in Giants history. He was the man on the ground in the Dominican Republic, and I'll talk a little bit more about him later on. And so you see Alex, I believe they're at the Polo Grounds for that shot. And he's there with 4 of his ball players. And then the final shot is Alex Pompez working as a scout for the Giants. That is 1954. He's actually attending a game, it might be 59 actually, now that I think about it. He's attending a game of the Richmond Braves. And I believe I have a later shot. It's really interesting who's he's attending this game with. So let's go into Alex. There's the other shot. The man to Alex Pompez's left, does anyone recognize the man with the bow tie? It's Joe Cambria. So Alex Pompez and Joe Cambria were associates going back to the 1920s in the Negro Leagues. And they would actually, as I talk about in Cuban Star, work together in bringing in a number of the Cuban and other Latin American players into the Washington Senators organization. They had a working arrangement where if they believed the guy was both good enough and white enough, they would try to get him into the Senators organization, typically playing with one of the teams associated with Joe Cambria, and hopefully channel him up that way. So when we look at Alex's baseball story, his life story, it allows us to understand the evolution of baseball from the 1920s into that era of Cepeda, Marichal, the Alou brothers, the Latinization of baseball, which many people didn't quite have, I think today don't quite understand. The Latinization of baseball really takes root in the 1960s. In 1962 was the first season that 10% of major league rosters, players in the major leagues, were Latino. And so it's a lot earlier than most folks realize. And Alex Pompez and Cambria have a huge role in making that a reality. how did we get here? How did baseball get to the Caribbean? Baseball arrived in the 1860s. It arrived first in Cuba. I love sharing this with my students at the University of Illinois. It was college students that really helped bring the game. They had Cuban elites sent their kids to study in the US with increasing regularity in the 1860s, partly because they didn't want to send, some elites didn't want to send them to Spain. They wanted to keep them out of control of the colonial rulers of Cuba. And in places like Spring Hill College in Alabama, they learned baseball and they brought it back. And then what would happen over the intervening decades in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, Cuba had 3 different wars for independence against Spain, and Cubans would migrate. Wherever they went, they brought baseball with them. And this is a great label, I thought, that someone put on the Cubans. He called them the apostles of baseball, because wherever they went, they shared the good news of the game. It's a really powerful description, but it's also important to note that it wasn't just professionals. It was people, just everyday folk who had learned the game, Cubans, and shared it. That really helped bring the game to the Dominican Republic in the 1880s, Puerto Rico in the 1890s, the Yucatan region of Mexico in the 1890s, and also northern coast of Venezuela. So that certain Caribbean, and I should also say, it helped to really popularize it in Key West, Florida, in Tampa, in the 1880s and 90s. So Cubans, wherever they settled, and I saw one description that really hit me, that wherever Cubans set up a community, they did 3 things. They built a cigar factory, they built a church, and they put a diamond in between them. So wherever they went, baseball was part of it. Now, Alex Pompez came from a very high pedigree. So this image here is the founding members of the Cuban Revolutionary Party of Key West, Florida chapter. Middle front is Jose Marti, credited as the father of the Cuban nation, political philosopher, writer, author of songs, poems. Guantanamera, that song that many of you are familiar with by Celia Cruz. It was Jose Marti that wrote Guantanamera. So you talk about a Renaissance man, that's the kind of person he was. Right behind Jose Marti, in the rear, standing tall, mustache, like all of them, except for one, is Jose Gonzalo Pompez. That is the father of Alex Pompez. And he would become an elected member of the Florida State House after they moved from Monroe County, Key West, to Tampa. And so again, we're seeing Alex Pompez coming from a family of connections, of means, and yet we see how different the trajectory of Pompez's life story will go compared to his father. Now, you might also note, yes, it's grayscale, it's an old image. Alex Pompez's father was much lighter skinned than Alex Pompez himself. Alex Pompez's mother, from what I have read, was Afro-Cuban and also had certain parentage in the Bahamas. So her family, it was in what they would call in Florida, a mixed race marriage, that in other places were actually outlawed, but they, being both born in Cuba, came to Key West and eventually settled in Tampa. And that's where Alex Pompez grew up, predominantly in Tampa. So here's some highlights of the Jose Gonzalo Pompez story. He naturalized as a citizen shortly after coming into Key West. He was a lawyer by training, owned a cigar factory where Alex learned about cigars. He also was responsible for helping to organize that first visit of Jose Marti to Key West. Later moves to Tampa. He actually was recruited to come to Tampa to set up a new cigar factory and business in Tampa, but also was the elected city clerk. And one of the amazing finds for me was when I went to Tampa, did research, the city charter papers are written in the handprint, in the handwriting of Jose Gonzalo Pompez. As city clerk, it was his duty to write it out. So again, well-educated, well-connected, but Alex's story takes on a different flavor. Part of it was because of what was going on in Florida and what was going on in Cuba. In Florida in the 1890s, we see the rise and the movement toward racial segregation and Jim Crow. And in Cuba in 1898, we see the Third Cuban Revolutionary War result in the independence of Cuba. Cubans had a choice, go back to Cuba or remain in the United States. One of the things that happened to Alex Pompez is that his father passes away before he can see Cuba as a free nation. And I don't have document verification, but the story is that Jose Gonzalo Pompez basically willed his estate, the majority of his estate, to the Cuban Revolutionary Party and for the cause of Cuban independence. And so, whereas Alex kind of grew up in a family of substantial means, after the War of Independence and after his father's death, it was a much more difficult economic situation for Alex Pompez, a young Alex Pompez. And what we see, he moves back and forth between Tampa and Havana, and he starts working at a cigar factory at the age of 18, and eventually decides Tampa's getting racially too hot. I'm going to Harlem. And he relocates to what becomes called Little Ybor City. And it's in Harlem. It's in the 110s. Right now, it is where I'm trying to remember this correctly, the Martin Luther King Homes is, that project. That is what was, those blocks was what was in the 19-teens called Little Ybor City, because so many Cubans, Afro-Cubans, had migrated from Tampa to New York, in particular to that area. One of the things that Alex got involved in once he got to Tampa was, not in Tampa, in New York, was the numbers game. And from 1916 to 1937, the proceeds from the numbers is what bankrolled his baseball operations. And there was a close connection between gambling, numbers, and baseball. We know this about Black baseball, the history of the Negro Leagues. In particular, members of the Harlem community looked at numbers through a particular lens. They said, how do these individuals use the money? Do they circulate the money within the community, or do they take it out and go and live elsewhere? Guys like Alex Pompez, Madame St. Clair were seen in a positive light because they lived in Harlem. Alex Pompez lived not far from the Polo Grounds. He eventually moves and has an apartment on Sugar Hill, 409 Edgecombe, which is, as we like to say, a stone's throw away, or maybe a Willie Mays throw away from where the Polo Grounds was. So Alex was very close to the Polo Grounds, and that too would become important with the New York Cubans operation. Last bullet on this slide notes that in 1932, during the Great Depression, his bank grossed between $5 and $7 million. That's not adjusted for 2021 numbers. That's in 1932 numbers. So it was one of the biggest banks in Harlem. And it was significant because, again, it allowed him to run a baseball team, eventually gain control of Dyckman Oval, and host a whole series of sporting events there. Here you have it, Dyckman Oval. There's a wonderful, this is actually from the New York Public Library. It is a beautiful image from 1935. The image at the New York Public Library is a lot actually cleaner than this, but you can see there how it says Dyckman Oval, home of New York Cubans. And it also says field for Black basketball, soccer, football. So all these other things were held there. Additionally, you can see the lights. Alex Pompez installed the lights and renovated Dyckman Oval to have it so they could host events as close to year-round as possible, but also key at night. There was also, through research I found, he did successfully, once Prohibition came to an end, was able to get a beer garden at Dyckman Oval. So people could relax when the Cubans or anyone else was not playing. The beer garden was there for folks to come in and enjoy themselves. Alex Pompez helped to change the game. A major contribution he made, particularly in Black baseball circuit, was he was the first Negro League owner to scout outside of Cuba. He went and found players in Panama, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. Part of the way he was able to do this, he traveled regularly to scout these areas. He took barnstorming teams about. He also started developing a system of scouting, of a network that he used former players to be the first individual to help him identify potential talent. And this is where we see he secures Horacio Martinez in 1933. The New York Cubans are playing in the Dominican Republic against, during the winter of 33 to 34. He sees this really fantastic shortstop, and he's like, I need him for my team. He recruits Martinez. Martinez is the shortstop for the New York Cubans from 34 to 47. Martinez, at the end of that year, when the Cubans finally win a World Series that nobody really saw because there was this guy named Jackie Robinson playing over at Ebbets Field and had attracted so many Black baseball fans to see him play. But the Cubans are victorious in 47. And what we see is Horacio retires and sets up shop in the Dominican Republic. He becomes the eyes on the ground for Alex Pompez, the individual bird dog scout who identifies that talent, who then calls Alex in and says, here's a guy, he was a track star, he's going to be here at the university, his name is Felipe Alou, I think we should look him up and look him over for the Giants. And so that was Horacio Martinez's role, and it's a very important role. Folks in the Dominican Republic revere the name Horacio Martinez because of his role. He was a great fielding shortstop. His nickname was Rabbit because many people, they compared him quite favorably to Rabbit Marinville. So again, Horacio has a great story. 47, the New York Cubans win the title, but they lose money. And Alex Pompez is in this very difficult situation. The Numbers Bank has been long gone. That ends really in 1938 after the trial of Jimmy Hines, in which Alex Pompez had been state evidence. There's a whole bunch more about that. You can read it in the book if you so desire. I find that story very entertaining. Includes Dutch Schultz and other New York figures. But staying to baseball, what we see is Alex Pompez and Horace Stoneham develop a relationship. In 1943, the Giants begin to lease the Polo Grounds to the Cubans to have their games. And so the Polo Grounds becomes the main place that the New York Cubans play their home games. Yes, they sometimes will head out to Brooklyn and they'll play at where the Bushwicks play, at Dexter Park. They'll head out over to Patterson, New Jersey, have some games, but Polo Grounds was their primary home site in which they played. That relationship develops further, and we see that Stoneham begins, once Jackie, particularly after Jackie Robinson was signed, Stoneham and his front office are turning to Pompez and asking him about who are some of these players that perhaps our organization should look at potentially signing. In 1948, that relationship becomes more formal in an informal way, in that the New York Giants are using the New York Cubans as an unofficial minor league team, as a farm team. And what this meant was Alex would give Stoneham and Carl Hubble first picks. Like if they saw a talented player, do you want them? No? Okay, I'm going to try to sell them to somewhere else. So this really began to kind of consolidate that relationship. And in 1950, after the Cubans have been disbanded, Stoneham hires Pompez to be a scout, scouting not just the Caribbean, but also the Black baseball circuit in the United States. And so Pompez is someone who's bilingual, who's very familiar with the culture of the US, the culture of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, is able to move across the Americas in ways that no one else in baseball had. Yes, Joe Cambria had spent a lot of time in Cuba, but Cambria only spoke a pidgin form of Spanish at best, and wasn't the insider in terms of the cultural knowledge that Alex Pompez had and what he represented to so many. So as I noted, 47, and the image, well, it's to my left on the screen. That's the 47 New York Cubans, and they win in 5 games, defeating the Cleveland Buckeyes. Alex had lost money, and we see the evolution. Also on that team, one of the important players is the gentleman you see on the right, which is Orestes Miñoso. He is not yet known, as Bill Beck would brand him, as Mini, but Orestes was a fine third baseman for the New York Cubans, appeared in 2 East-West Classics, which was the Negro League's All-Star Game. And after the 48 season, he would actually be sold, his contract would be sold to the Cleveland Indians. Unfortunately, the Giants opted not. After all, they had this kid in center field in a few years, but they did have Monty Irving already. So they passed on Miñoso. Miñoso would make his mark actually in the American League with the White Sox. Now, this was an image. One of the things I do every now and then is I will Google, I'll put Pompez and see all the images that pop up. This is from either 1958 or 1959. It's at the Melbourne practice for spring training facility. Seated center of the entire image, holding a baseball in his hand, is Alex Pompez. You will see a number of Latino luminaries in this shot. First row, second one in from the left, my left, on screen, left-handed glove. That's Matty Alou. Right next to Alex Pompez is the father of Danny Tartable, Jose Tartable. Second one in from the right, there's Felipe Alou. Also in this image, I'm trying to relocate him, is Julio Navarro, Jose Pagan, and oh, here he is. Right in front of Alex Pompez, holding his glove like this, there's Juan Marichal, the Dominican dandy.
Oh, shit.
Alex Pompez, each of those guys is someone that Alex had signed. So I love that the Giants or the photographer, somebody said, hey, let's get all these guys that Pompez has signed and let's take a shot. And again, a number of these guys made it to the majors. One of the guys who didn't is in the very back row. His name, Rafael Alomar, the uncle of, not Roberto, of Sandy Alomar Sr. So again, you have, this is kind of guys from Dominican, Puerto Rico, Cuba. That was the reach of Alex Pompez. You also have, in this particular image, there's a guy from Panama, from Nicaragua. So again, you see how wide a net and a network Alex Pompez has constructed to bring in talent into the Giants organization. Now, one of the main things that Alex Pompez and the Giants were able to offer was the awareness of the cultural adjustment that Latino players would have to face. Guys like Orlando Cepeda, Juan Marichal, they had an advocate in Alex Pompez, someone who, in certain instances, had coached some of their baseball heroes, had been the owner of the team. I shouldn't say coach, was the owner of the team of some of their baseball heroes coming out of the Dominican Republic. I remember talking to Ozzie Virgil. And now Virgil was not one of the players that Alex signed, but Ozzie was very senior, was very familiar with Alex Pompez. And I told him that the first Dominican that Alex brought into the Negro Leagues was Pedro Alejandro San. And Virgil smiles and he's like, the name of the ballpark today in our hometown in the Dominican Republic is named after Pedro Alejandro San. That the Dominicans, he was a very much revered pitcher. And so having that history of understanding what a young Dominican, Puerto Rican, Latino player was going to go through. And Hubble would have Pompez travel throughout, not just the minor league circuit, excuse me, not just during the spring training time, but throughout the year to hit different towns where the Latino players were, check in on them, see how they're doing. It was so far ahead of what other major league teams were doing. Most major league organizations basically left the players on the vine to you either develop or you fall apart. And the Giants had a better system in place because they had hired Alex Pompez. And here's what Alex Pompez told Robert Boyle, who was a writer for Time Life, wrote for Sports Illustrated. In 1965, he explained on how he advised the players, how do you approach being a Black Latino or a Latino player in the United States, and what can you do? And showing both sensitivity and awareness of the challenge that these guys were going to face, and that the reality was they're not going to change Jim Crow laws in and of themselves. They have to understand how it works and try to work their way through it to succeed and ultimately become a major league talented player. So Alex Pompez was more than just a talent evaluator. And this, I think, again, is one of the manners in which he deserves a lot of credit. He was a cultural translator. Felipe Alou shared this thought with a friend of mine who interviewed Felipe, Larry Hogan. And he said about Pompez, he used to explain to us the rules of the game and also the rules for Blacks. It was very important to have a man like him who knew the society so well to explain to us the limitations we had, to protect us from falling into a problem of some sort. And one of the really interesting things in the number of interviews I did was a particular event that happened in Melbourne that both Julio Navarro and Felipe and Orlando Cepeda all mentioned about what happened when one of the Latino players had whistled at a couple of the young girls walking by the Melbourne facility. Alex was very worried, and he brought all the guys together and basically scolded them, tell them, you cannot do this. This is very dangerous in Florida to not just react, but to behave that way. And it's noteworthy that this was basically a year or so after we had seen the lynching of Emmett Till in Alabama. And Alex very much understood that the dangers for these young men, most of whom were Black, that they could not behave in ways that many others could, and that perhaps they had behaved in the Dominican or in Puerto Rico, that they had to learn about how social norms and laws were in the United States, and that this presented dangers to them as young Black men. All right, so moving toward the wrap up. Here you see a number of, well, actually all of these individuals that Alex Pompez had a role in signing, bringing into the United States, from Manny Mota, Willie McCovey, while he was already in the United States, Martin Diego, who he brought in to play for the Cuban Stars as an 18-year-old out of Cuba. At the very bottom, there's this image of, in particular, I draw your attention to the most nattily attired men with the hats and all. And that is a very young Juan Marichal and Horacio Martinez. That was right after Marichal had been signed in the Dominican Republic to the Giants. So it was a very happy day for the future Giant, and I think for the Giants organization. Now, Jack Schwartz was another individual who recognized the value that Alex Pompez presented to the Giants organization through what he did as a scout and as a cultural translator. It's a long quote. I'm not going to read it, but I love the context of why Jack Schwartz wrote a letter to the Wall Street Journal, because the Wall Street Journal had just written a long article about how the Dodgers were the first team to go into the Dominican, to bring out talent, and to really, develop. And this is as we're beginning to see the first fruits of the Alfredo Griffins and Pedro Guerrero coming up through the Dodger system. And this poor sports writer thought, hey, this is something new. Schwartz is like, no, this is not new at all. The Giants, we were the first ones in the Dominican Republic. We were the first ones because we had Alex Pompez. And he went down there and he worked with Chick Genovese, and they got the best talented players. Again, the image that you see here is from the Dominican Republic, and it's Alex Pompez visiting with, and again, you can tell this is an older Alex Pompez visiting with an older Horacio Martinez. That relationship between them as a player starts in 33 and would go all the way through the end of Alex Pompez's life. This last image reminds us like the world and the route that Alex Pompez himself had traveled. Here you had a man who started in Florida, came to Harlem, was a numbers king, fled the country, fled the United States, worried about how Dutch Schultz and his guys were going to get him. And comes back, states evidence. And after Ted Williams had given that induction speech in 1966, and the Hall of Fame finally was moved to putting together a blue ribbon panel on Negro leaguers to bring in the best of Black baseball into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Who should be considered? Bowie Kuhn, who sits there in the center front, put together this group. Right next to Bowie Kuhn is Alex Pompez. He was named to this blue ribbon panel. I remember I had the opportunity to talk to Kuhn many years ago at a conference, and I asked him, did you know about Alex's story? How he came out of the numbers racket into, this very prominent role. He's like, we really didn't. He said, I didn't know about Alex's background. All I knew is every person I spoke with about who is someone who has knowledge about Black baseball, about the players, who's respected. They kept telling me, Alex Pompez, you got to talk to Alex Pompez. And that's how Alex gets to serve on the first Veterans Committee, or the new Negro League Committee, that was created by the Baseball Hall of Fame. And that would help bring in that first wave of talented players like Satchel, like Josh Gibson, Cole Papa Bell, Buck Leonard, to get into the Hall of Fame. And in 2006, I had the honor of serving on another Negro League committee, which we voted Alex and a host of 16 others, including Effa Manley, into the Baseball Hall of Fame in recognition of the profound impact that they had had on baseball history. So thank you for your time and a couple other things, but I'll stop sharing now, and I would love to hear any questions you might have.
First of all, Alex,
Wow.
I don't think anybody really knew a lot of the stuff you're talking about. Fabulous. If somebody wants your book, what is the books? What are the best ways to get it?
You can do it on Amazon. You can reach out via the world's biggest seller of books, or you can go to your local bookstore if there's still a couple there wherever you are, and order it. So you can go directly to University of California Press to pick up a copy of Playing America's Game, and anywhere else. I just like share it for folks to have the opportunity to get to know his story and why it matters more.
Terrific. I got two quick, I guess, ladder questions for you. Number one, a few years ago in Harlem, they dedicated a street to Matty Alou. And I just want your opinion. Did you feel it should have gone to Felipe Alou or Alou Brothers way, or what is your feeling about that? And how do you feel about the golden era having Minnie Minoso on the ballot?
I'm totally for Minnie being on the ballot. I await the day, and hopefully we're alive to see it, where he too is elected. I think too often, and I have many behind me in various forms. I think today we're more fully aware of the challenges that someone like Minnie Minoso went through in becoming an integration pioneer, were much more sensitive about it than were his own contemporaries in terms of those who covered the game.
Yeah, I guess I meant not on the ballot. I guess I meant to ask you, do you think he is worthy of induction?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Absolutely, yes. Not only was he the first Black Latino, he was excellent. When you look at 51 to 61, the top outfielders in the American League, Mickey, Ted, and Minnie. That's it. Those are your top three. With all the new analytics, those are the three that come on top. Minnie also, the other thing is, yes, MLB recognized Negro leagues as major league. They brought their stats over. For the known stats that we have for Minnie in the Negro leagues, his batting average is exactly the same as what we had for his time in MLB, 299. So what we're seeing is he was a consistent professional, major leaguer. He shouldn't have spent a single day in the minor leagues. He was MLB ready from day one. He had the glorious misfortune of being acquired by the Cleveland Indians, the most active American League team in getting Black and Latino players as soon as they could into the league. But, you know, and the other thing I say about Minnie, he did not get better from April 30th, 1951 to May 1st, 1951. He got a shot. And we saw from the very first day in the MLB with the White Sox, he was on fire. So yes, I think Minnie has long merited being inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame, and I'm hoping that this December that becomes a reality. Your first question about Alu, yeah, I didn't know that they had named, I'm sure it must be in Washington Heights somewhere.
Yes.
But yeah, I didn't really know. I do have a funny story when I was, and it's not about Alu, but it's about Washington Heights and Dyckman. So I was in search of the Dyckman projects. I was on foot and I'm trying to find out, because I knew it was on Nagel Ave and somewhere else. I walk into a bodega and I ask, like, where's Nagel Ave? And the person's like, looks at me in Spanish, like, yo no sé dónde está Nagil. Or Nagel, Nagil está ahí. And it's like, I don't know where Nagel Ave, and then pronounces it in Spanish, but there's a street that sounds like that. It's over here. And I went and walked and I found Dyckman projects. I think one of the things that New York City should do is actually have a placard, a historical site designation, recognizing that Dyckman Oval was the only park in New York City that was operated by a Negro League owner for the purpose of Black sports entertainment. Like, you know, that wasn't the reality in Dexter Park. It wasn't the reality in the Olympic ring, Oval, but all these other places were not operated by a Negro League owner like Alex Pompez was. And it's a really important thing. Babe Ruth played at Dyckman. After he had finished with the Yankees, he played a special game against Negro Leaguers at Dyckman Oval. It's a really interesting place that has a lot of history. Black football was there. Fritz Pollard played games at Dyckman Oval. And yes, just like the Polo Grounds, it was converted into space for a project, but we can still recognize the important history that was there.
Questions? Anybody with a question for Adrian?
I had two quick ones that, Adrian, first, I did read the book and now I'm rereading, and I have to do that because I can't remember everything. And that book is a sociological as well as a baseball study. I have two questions that kind of, you understand the man, and maybe you can tell us how, you know, if these things would have come to pass. His father, you know, down in Ybor City was the cigar king and made all this money. And you don't speak about how great the wealth is, but I assume it was fairly large. And yet he made that important decision to give it all to the Cuban Revolution. That was his decision, and he was heartfelt in doing so. But I would ask you, from your understanding of the size of that estate and how comprehensive it was, if he had shared that I guess, obviously, with Alex and his brothers and sisters. If that had gone to them, and here's the question, would he have, by necessity, and he did it by necessity, I think you'd agree, go into the numbers racket, which got dirty and dicey for him towards the end? Would he have had to have done, would he have done that had he had the funding from his father? I know we're second guessing, but I just wanted to get a better feel for the man. That was question one, if you would.
Yeah, it is an interesting question because it wasn't until after his father's death that Alex was moving back and forth between Havana. He's 16, 17 years old, between Havana and Tampa. And at one point, Alex says that it was when he was like 16 back in Havana that he got infected with the love of baseball.
Mhm.
And like, if his father had lived, I don't know if they're moving that way back and forth. He probably would have continued to travel in more elite circles and more likely had been, you know, a legit businessman from throughout. And now, would that have kept him outside of baseball? I don't know, because as I noted, there is a very close relationship between cigar manufacturing and baseball that really sustains tobacco and baseball in Cuba. Sugar in baseball in Cuba. Like, there was this very commercial lies tie-in between these commodities and baseball, and it was part of the Cuban culture. And so, you know, that part, it's harder to kind of discern what Alex would have ultimately done. But, you know, one of the fortunate effects of this is that Alex had to find his path, his own path, and that what took him to baseball and took him to numbers and baseball. Because as soon as he got to New York, he starts working with Nat Strong as a booking agent and learns the trade of booking agents. So he's working with Nat Strong and also getting involved in the numbers game at the same time. And so, you know, that's where he was able to parlay his winnings into his passion, which was baseball.
One of the other things you touch upon in the book is he was one of the few owners that not only owned the team, but managed it. And you alluded to the fact that got him into a few problems with the players. Can you speak of any of the specific issues that he had with those players who, you know, he wrote the paycheck, but he was also calling the shots in the dugout, at least for a while, I guess?
Yeah, well, and even like early on, he traveled with the team. He would write the lineup card. Eventually, he will hand over the team to guys like Martin Diego, Jose Maria Fernandez, and even a few others who would manage the team. But he always was kind of like the general manager. He was constantly looking for new talent, negotiating with players, and he was very much a hands-on owner with deep baseball knowledge. I think one of the things we see very differently between most Major League Baseball team owners and a number of the ones operating teams in the Negro Leagues is that deep baseball knowledge, not just a passion for operating kind of at this level, this high level, operating a franchise, but really knowing. I had a really interesting series of discussions with a former scout who wrote several books himself on baseball. And at first he was kind of dubious about Alex's scouting acumen till I gave him a list and he started looking at it's like, I noticed that Alex has this preference for guys who have these long sinewy stems, like arms and legs. And actually, you know, Martin Diego's body type, like he had a body type he looked for, and which often really translated into how a scout, like, okay, he has this, now let me see him run, let me see him throw, okay, he can fill out that body, this is a good prospect. And you know, this is something, and I probably have this book on my shelf somewhere, but I'm forgetting his name at the moment, that this one particular scout noted that like Alex Pompez had a type, and most of those guys became phenomenal baseball players. And, you know, Minnie's that same kind of body build. So
thank you.
Thanks for your questions, Bill.
Harvey, go ahead, Harvey.
Harvey.
Professor, thank you for your service. Thank you for this wonderful talk. This is just mesmerizing, absolutely. My question centers on the great Juan Marichal. I'm going to guess that you've met him and spoken to him. How did the Giants get Juan Marichal?
The Giants got Juan Marichal because of Horacio Martinez. Horacio Martinez was the athletic director at the University of Santo Domingo. And Juan was about to enroll as a student at the university. He was a javelin star. He represented the Dominican Republic at a series of Caribbean meets among the Caribbean islands. And Martinez saw something more in Marichal. So, I'm sorry, I'm confusing a loose story with Marichal. He saw Marichal actually.
Tell that story also after you finish with Juan.
Yeah. All right. So back to Marichal. They saw Marichal at playing a game against he's playing for the Air Force. That is the team that the brother of Rafael Trujillo, Ramfi's team at the Air Force, and noticed the talent that this young kid had. And as Juan noted, at this point, Juan Marichal doesn't have the highlight kick. He's a submariner. And the best pitcher who had actually died in this horrific airplane crash that killed the Dominican national team, his last name was Rivera, was this submarine style. And Juan's like, that's how I was pitching. That's how I learned to pitch. And Horacio Martinez sees that talent and calls up Alex Pompez, cables him, and it's like, we got a guy for you. He's pitching for the Air Force team, but you know, I don't think they're going to stop him from leaving to go play professionally. And that is what got Marichal on their radar. And you know, from there out, the Giants were the inside. People so loved Horacio Martinez because they knew him from the time he played in the Dominican Republic, left for the Negro Leagues. He would play in the Dominican League throughout the winters, and he became the head baseball coach and eventually the athletic director at the University of Santo Domingo. So many people knew that Horacio was the person that if you get in with him, your path to MLB, to the Giants and MLB, is going to be a lot smoother.
Hello?
So you're saying that Juan Marichal was a submariner at one point?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. When he signed with the Giants, he was a submariner. He learns in rookie ball how he's taught how to pitch overhand. And so that changed baseball history. It was a great story that Juan shared about how he learned how to pitch overhand.
Hello?
Is that all right, Frank? Is that you?
Yes, you didn't mention Rafael Noble.
Oh, Ray Noble. Oh man, I love Ray Noble. He has the very unique distinction of having played in the Caribbean World Series, having won the Negro League World Series, and having played in the MLB World Series. He's probably the first Negro Leaguer to accomplish that. That series of wins. Noble, I met him out at his house I should say his apartment in Brooklyn before he passed. And after he played, he became a stevedore out in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And he still had these massive hands. And I was like, you put a baseball bat in that man's hands, and you can understand how far he could hit it. Also, he was known as a bit of an enforcer for his team. With him behind the plate and guys in the Negro Leagues knocking you down, you thought twice about trying to create a ruckus with the pitcher out there.
Jose Valdivieso?
Now, Jose, I didn't know, and I didn't get the opportunity to talk to. Others who I know did talk with Jose. So I don't have much I could share about him.
And one more thing. When these guys worked in the United States, remember there was a military draft in those days. Were they all exempt from the American draft?
So The Puerto Ricans weren't, because it's part of the US. And so guys like Orlando Cepeda, Jose Pagan, those guys had to be concerned about potentially getting drafted. Those who were playing in the minor leagues were not as likely to get drafted, because particularly in the low minor leagues where the season was only 4 months. After I write about this in Playing America's Game, during World War II, they made the Selective Service created a new rule that if you were on a visa of 9 months or longer in the United States, then you had to make yourself eligible for the Selective Service, regardless of your national citizenship. That's when you saw quite a few guys leave MLB and the Negro Leagues and head to Mexico. But in the 50s, you did have guys, of course, Willie Mays and others who would spend time in the military service. And you also saw guys like Roberto Clemente spend time serving in the Marine Corps reserves. But I don't know how exactly. I know Ozzie Virgil also spent some time in the Marines. So some of the guys did do a stint, some time. Others, most of them, however, were able to avoid it. And I think it was primarily because they were coming from a foreign country and their citizenship status didn't put them in a situation where they were likely to be called in.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else with a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Jeff,
Why
go ahead.
do you think, not so much why the Giants were so far ahead in getting players into the organization from Latin America? Why were other teams, for lack of a better term, so slow in the process? What made the Giants more proactive versus some of the other teams that took them a lot longer?
I think a lot of it had to do with the relationship that Stoneham and Pompez developed in the 1940s. Having the New York Cubans and other Negro League teams playing in the Polo Grounds provided the Giants the opportunity to see how much talent there was there. And other, like, of course, the Yankees did not feel like they needed to bring in Latino players from the Caribbean, particularly Black Latinos. I mean, Luis Arroyo was a little different because he was lighter skinned, but Victor Peyote got traded away for a bag of balls and some peanuts from the Yankees to Cleveland. I'm sorry, Eddie Robinson retired shortly after joining the Yankees. And what a terrible trade, but it was because he was a rambunctious, fun-loving Black Puerto Rican that Vic Power gets traded away. And so many major league teams were still holding on to the traditions of the past. And it took the Giants really thinking about, like, how do I put myself in a better position? This is what brought them in. This is how they got Hank Thompson, Monty Irving. Remember, 1947, Hank Thompson is with the St. Louis Browns, and 30-day contract, he's sent back to the Negro Leagues. Hank, you talk about someone who had military service. He was serving, and during World War II, he was at the Battle of the Bulge. He had PTSD. He was unfortunately, he had a problem with alcohol. He was an ornery individual who had PTSD. But he goes to Cuba in 1950. And while he's playing there, he starts to recapture that form that got him the opportunity in 1947. And Alex Pompez writes to the Giants and is like, I think we should give Thompson a shot. Like, let's sign this guy. And eventually we see Thompson with 51 team and really becomes an important part of those early 1950 teams. Monty was the rock. Monty was the one that made everyone feel we can have a Hank Thompson because Monty's there to help us with any situation. And I think that is what helped the Giants understand, because the same way that Alex was translating for the players in a cultural sense, he was also helping Stoneham, Hubble, and later Jack Schwartz understand how these players will definitely commit themselves to your organization and to being, MLB players. And this is their dream. This is what they want to do. Most places, most organizations, I should say, were not committed. They don't hire, the Dodgers, who got all this credit. It wasn't they got Ralph Avila involved with the organization that we actually see. So you have a Cuban who becomes the pathway into the Dominican Republic for the Dodgers. So it does very much help to have someone with insider knowledge. But in Alex's case, it worked both ways, from his time as baseball ops guy with running his own organization and team, but also his experience as a Black Latino and how that worked in the United States.
Adrian, you got time for some more questions?
Yeah.
Perfect. We'll go to Paul and then Hindi. Paul?
Yeah. Hi, Adrian. Thank you so much. What a wonderful program. One of the things that we've been kicking around as members of the New York Giants baseball group is whether or not Horace Stoneham deserves a shot at the Hall of Fame, given his progressive attitude toward Latino and Hispanic players and Black players. What do you think?
If Colonel Rupert's in, it's like, yeah, again, I think one of the really interesting things and what has evolved is a greater sensibility among voters in the 2020s and the 20-teens about looking at the past and the events that transpired, and in particular, understanding that Branch Rickey was not the only individual that had to exercise courage and in bringing in talented players that had been excluded before. So many people, I think, I don't want to minimize at all what Branch Rickey did, but they made it seem like he was the only executive to take on risk, to take on the challenge of integration. He did it first, but just because, if you notice, yes, you have Luis Rodriguez Olmo with the Dodgers in 42 and 43, but you don't see a Latino presence other than Sandy Amros, another Pompez guy from the Cubans, on the Dodgers. Like, outside of that, you don't see any Latino players on the Dodgers really till these guys come up out of the Dominican in the late 70s, early 80s. And so you have a 30-year stretch where not many Latino players are scouted and developed by the Dodgers. So after Rickey, you don't see the Dodgers really venture into Latin America. And Stoneham has his own story, his own history. And I think he wasn't like what oftentimes when I read the newspapers, it seemed like they were saying the other executives just copy Rickey's playbook. No, that's not what the Giants did, because Rickey did not work with the Negro Leagues to bring in Black baseball talent. He wanted to just take them. And that's what fired up Effa Manley. It's like, you're not taking my guys without compensating me. Stoneham and the Giants, they were smart in terms of, we're going to hire an executive out of the league, and we're going to use that person as our point person and bringing in talent. That's a very different vision of integration. It's about integrating off the field and not just on the field. And that's what helps them bring in African-American talent from throughout the United States. This is what gets you McCovey. This is what gets you early on Willie Mays. But other guys that come in through the system, Marshall Bridges, Andres Rogers out of the Bahamas, like, you get Black Americans very broadly understood, and US-born Black Americans coming into the organization. And the power of the word and trust that people within the community had toward the Giants was very different than a lot of the other major league organizations. So that's a really particular story that I think Stoneham did have a hand in. And again, yeah, people like to talk about the drinking, and yeah, he's not the only one. But yeah, there's things that he made. So, I think he deserves a serious consideration of belonging in with the other executives of that era.
Thanks, Adrian. Thank you.
All right, we'll go to Hindi and then Tom Sheehy. Hindi and then Tom and then Renee.
Renee, okay.
Wonderful presentation. I just loved it. So watching the World Series and the translators for some of the players, how did they deal with the English language and translations? Did they have translators on the team
So
in those days?
it's interesting because with the Cubans, the New York Cubans, Pompez was bilingual. And so Alex loved to drop by the office of the New York Age and talk to Dan Burley, one of their sports writers. And before that, Romeo Daughtry and others at the Amsterdam News. He had the ability to kind of move between languages. Several of his players would also develop that capacity. But they also knew that they could, like, the Cubans could have someone who can bridge the language and bring that story to the English language sources. The other thing is that you also had a number of the African-American sports writers would travel to Cuba during the winter to see these players there. And so developed a relationship. Some of those same sports writers would cover the early periods of integration. You also, like a guy like Ozzie Virgil was already bilingual. Julio Navarro, his story becomes really important because he, although we often talk about him as Puerto Rican, he actually came from St. Croix, a Virgin Islander. And he was English. He was bilingual before, when the Giants signed him, he was already bilingual. And a number of the other guys talk about that I've interviewed that were playing in the minor leagues with the Giants before they came up. They're like, man, we're so fortunate to have Julio around because we could always go to him and he would tell us what's going on and help us understand. He would talk for us. And so that practice of players being each other's translators is really the MLB model till what, 10 years ago, 8 years ago. It's a challenge because some organizations very much, relied on Latino players being translators for the other guys. And that became more difficult because it was an added burden that, you would see, Jorge Posada would do it for El Duque. But that's not his job. Henry Blanco did it for a whole bunch of guys when he was a bullpen catcher for the Cubs. But he wasn't a professional translator or interpreter. So, finally, Carlos Beltran and a few others were able to convince the powers that be within MLB, within the commissioner's office and the MLBPA that, yes, we should have paid translators on staff able to represent. And what I really enjoy about it is that doesn't mean that the players are not going to try to learn English, is that at various moments they're going to feel more comfortable speaking in Spanish and know that they have someone who will help them out. And that's really important because you're going to get a lot more from that player. And then you have, I'm not a Braves fan, but I am a Ozzie Albies fan because anytime someone can be not a polyglot, speaking English, Spanish, Dutch, and papamiento, and be eloquent in all of them. I like that kind of individual.
Tom Sheehan, you're up.
Thanks, Gary. Adrian, a couple of quick questions. I'm curious if there was a connection between Dolph Luque and Pompez.
So Luque basically was part of the Giants orbit way before Alex was. I don't have so yes, they came across each other a number of instances during the Cuban Winter League. Dolph Luque was a manager for decades in Cuba. And Pompez was down there scouting players, networking, and a few of the players he get would be off the Havana team that Luque was a part of. But I actually don't have anything about them sharing space and time. Okay. I do have that and actually I didn't have it as part of this PowerPoint deck, but there's an image from the 1950s of Minnie and Alex maintained their relationship into, until again, Alex's death in 1972. And so there's this image, it's Christmas time, there's a tree in the background. Alex has a cigar, and Minnie has a cigar, and this other gentleman is there who's actually hosting them at his apartment in New York City. So for certain, Minnie and Alex kept together for many years. Luque again was a predecessor, and so one of the reasons why Alex Pompez goes out beyond Cuba to get talent was that the initial baseball team operators, Tinti Molina and Abel Linares, guys who actually did bring Luque into playing in the United States and eventually become an MLB player, they froze Pompez out. They didn't want Alex Pompez to be a power mover in Cuba. And so Alex eventually decides, I got to widen out my net, and that's where he's bringing in Dominicans and Venezuelans and Panamanians way before anyone else is doing it. And eventually Molina and Linares' influence diminishes in the 30s, and Alex is able to really bring in whoever he wants.
Let's see. I was asking because my main subject of research is Tom Sheehan. It was my great uncle, and he was a teammate of Luque's with the 25 Reds, and became a scout with the Giants in 1948.
Okay.
He was the scout that signed Ruben Gomez.
Okay.
And Cepeda called him the great white father of the Caribbean, actually, at one point. And I've spoken to Cepeda and Marichal about him. And I was wondering if his name, if you can shed any light on his role with the Giants beyond the signing of Gomez.
I would have to go back through some of my materials to see if his name pops up. Like, I know that Genovese, Frank and George worked more closely together. Like Alex, Frank, and Chick, or Chick and George, they did a lot of the cross-checking on each other in terms of the other scout who comes in and validates the assessment of a player or not. But I would have to look more closely for Tom Sheehan's name within that. Okay. The name is familiar, but that just might be baseball history speaking, and not just what I found.
Would you mind if I follow up with you through email?
Absolutely.
Or?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Renee,
Thanks
you're up.
for all your time.
Thanks, Tom. Renee.
What a great discussion we got going here. But I have a question regarding one of the New York Cubans, El Maestro. Got a name that all of a sudden escapes me. I had it on my head.
I think the Eagle. Are you talking about?
Yeah. I mean, didn't he lead the Negro leagues in home runs for a few years? And he was a pitcher, infield, outfielder. Do you have anything on him? I mean, any stories?
Yeah, there was a couple of them. So 1935 is one of the stories that really tells you about Martin Diego. So the New York Cubans and the Pittsburgh Crawfords are fighting for the Negro National League pennant. And they're playing a series, and it's the final game of the series. Whoever wins this will win the pennant. And Martin Diego has, oh man, I remember Johnny Schoolboy Taylor was the pitcher for the game, and he starts getting hit a little bit. And so Martin's like, oh man, I don't know if the team's going to hold on. And he's like, I'm going to put myself in the pitch. And unfortunately, that lineup that featured Buck Leonard and others got to Martin, and the Cubans end up losing the game in the championship. And Diego was forever, and this is an account that Schoolboy Taylor's daughter told me, like that Diego was always like, did I do the right thing? I should have warmed up more, or like that name really, or that game really stuck out in his head. But Martin Diego comes to the Cuban Stars in 1923. He's 18 years old, and they put him at second base. and he's so young and so powerful. The arm was too good for second base, so they eventually moved him to center field, and they put him on the mound. Between his career in the Negro leagues, in the Mexican League, and in Cuba, he easily surpassed 400 wins as a pitcher. He was an incredible player. He's actually the more natural comparison to Shohei. Yeah, I don't think Babe Ruth's because Babe literally moved from the mound to being that power hitting right fielder. Martin Diego he would pitch, go to center the next game, center, and then 2 games later he's back on the mound. And so he was kind of like the Angels did with Shohei this year, moving back and forth between the mound and the field. And yes, he led the Eastern Cuddle League a couple of seasons in home runs. And he was a powerful player. Like, he hit those line drive ropes that go out so quick that you're like, what happened? And that was the kind of player he was. He was also very respected. And this is part of the reason why Alex Pompez has him be the guy to run the team, to be, because Martin Diego becomes really the first trusted manager that Alex Pompez has, where he's like, okay, I'm letting go. And Diego runs the team for several years. 1938, Pompez flees. Diego goes to Mexico. This is when the Mexican League was formed by the Jorge Pasquel, and Diego is the player manager of Veracruz. And he's on the mound, he's in the field, he's running the team, and he would be in that role for over a decade in Veracruz, and he had a very long career in baseball. And yeah, I think, as others have said, he's the greatest player most people have never heard of.
I mean, he's in the Hall of Fame everywhere. I mean, Cooperstown, Cuba,
Mexico, Dominican, Venezuela,
right. When the Negro Leagues dissolved, how old was he?
1905, so
yeah, he was 45, 46, but he stays on in Mexico. He was managing in Mexico throughout that period.
I mean, he managed. So I guess I was thinking maybe he'd be on the majors as a scout. You know what I'm saying? Some form of. Again, bringing Latin players in, helping that cause.
Well, he helped a different cause, and he became the Ministry of Sport in Cuba under Castro. He was the Minister of Sport in the province of Santa Clara, which his hometown of Cienfuegos was a part of. And again, I'm a historian. I had the incredible experience of holding a document. It was in Cuba, so they didn't have us wearing gloves for some reason. That was typed and signed by Martin Diego. I was like, wow, and it was just a local matter of the sport district that he was running. But it was like, wow, this is something pretty incredible. So yeah, he ends up going to Cuba, and he was a socialist, and he believed in the vision of socialism for his country. And so that's why he, and many Cubans will tell you this, there's a difference between being a Castro fan and follower and being a socialist. He said Diego was a socialist. He believed his country deserved better.
Adrian, you got a few more, okay? Or
I see Peter with his hand raised. I don't know.
I got a quick question. I know you're a professor in Illinois. But your knowledge of the Giants is wonderful. Do you still follow the Giants? Are you a Cub fan or?
Oh no, not the Cubs. Oh no, my National League team, if there is one, is the Giants. It's because of the history. I was born at Bronx Lebanon Hospital on the Grand Concourse. And when my family left New York, they resettled a mile and a half from Little Yankee Stadium. So by birthright, I was a Yankee fan. But I'm also I love the White Sox. I love their Cuban story, their Latino story. I see you, Tom. And I love that, you know, they've committed themselves to kind of maintaining that connection with Cuba and Latino fans. So
I was born in this. I was born in the same hospital.
all right.
One more thing.
So what do you think of Camilo Doval?
For who?
Camilo
Oh, Camilo
Doval.
Doval. I don't know enough about Doval yet. You know, this past season was. I'm still stunned that the Giants won so many games.
One more.
We
thing.
all
Adrian,
are.
one more. Al Lopez, was he part of this system?
No. In fact, so I was at this event in Naperville, Illinois, at Northern Illinois University, and Minnie was there, and we had dinner afterwards. This is 20 plus years ago. I was just finishing up my doctorate at Michigan, so yeah, it's around 2000. And we asked Minnie. It was Marcos Breton, a longtime sports writer out there in the Bay Area. Myself and Minnie at dinner, and we asked him about how was it having Al Lopez as your manager? And we were thinking this, you know, to have someone who was Spanish speaking would perhaps be a good thing. And I don't know if the couple of drinks that Minnie had allowed him to loosen his lips, and he said basically, Al Lopez was an SOB to us. He was harder on Black Cubans and Black Latins than anybody else because he expected so much. I don't know if it was his Spanish blood, but he wasn't Cuban. And you know, Al Lopez, and this is Minnie. It's like Al Lopez wasn't Cuban. His family was from Spain, and he says like, he didn't understand why. Then he says, you know, every time I played for Al Lopez, he traded me away. And so, unfortunately, I thought there was going to be a positive story there, and Minnie was like, no. And I think one of the things that perhaps affected Minnie's case with the Veterans Committee was how long Al Lopez was on that committee, and Al was not going to advocate. And the way the old Veterans Committee worked, if someone you played for doesn't advocate for you, you're not getting in.
Thanks. All right, Peter, you're up.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Adrian. Adrian, two questions. This first one is quick. For how long did Pompez live at 49 Edgewater?
49. Do you mean 409 Edgecombe?
Oh, 409 Edgewater, yeah. 409.
He lived at 409, and I would have to dig out my notes to give you exact dates, but he gets over there probably around 42 or 43. And he gets married with Ruth Selden, and they actually move out to Queens, to Astoria, if I remember correctly. And they had a brick ranch out there, and that was probably like 51, 52 so it was about 8 or 9 years he lived at 409 Edgecombe. Now, as I write in the book, Ruth Selden's was the aunt of Edward Brooke, the senator from Massachusetts. And even Brooke, in his memoir, Bridging the Divide, talks about spending some time during his childhood of at the 409 Edgecombe place, and how Ruth and Alex would be counting up some of the proceeds of their various ventures.
Thank you. And also, what tie, if any, did Pompez have in setting up the Willie Mays show game when he was with the Black Barons?
That
Of course.
That's a good question. I don't know right off the top. I'd have to really dig back in because that was kind of what I know Alex did was say you ought to give the guy a look. Like this kid is amazing, but what's his name? Hayes, the owner of the Birmingham Black Barons. Yeah, he was the one who that was his guy. That Willie Mays was his player, and Tom Hayes would be the person who would have to make the local arrangements down there in Birmingham to put this together. So, I don't know. Alex had a more direct role in the Giants getting Monty than because Monty was with Newark, and Alex knew of him quite well, and everyone who knew Monty Irving spoke very highly of him. So, but I would have to really dig back through my notes to see how what I have about Alex's role with the 48, 49 time period in terms of Birmingham and getting connected eventually to Willie Mays.
As I understand it, Pompez kept that game out of the papers. That was a show game for Carl Hubble, and nobody was supposed to know about it. I believe there was no publicity. They wanted no fans, and there was no write-up of the game.
Now, thank you for that reminder. This is where Alex Pompez's connection to the New York Age,
newspapers.
Yeah, the newspapers. That's what he was able to be able to do. For the longest time, Dan Burley wrote for the New York Age, and Romeo Daughtry was writing for the Amsterdam News. So Alex Pompez's connections with that world of the Black newspaper and the New York Age in particular was so great that when the 50th wedding anniversary of the publisher of the New York Age, I'm forgetting his first name, his last name was Moore. It was a big shindig in Harlem, and Alex is among the invited guests. So is W.E.B. Du Bois, and a number of other so the intellectual set, the numbers king, Madam St. Clair was also among the invited guests to this event. And in fact, when I forget who asked about 409 Edgecombe, Du Bois lived for a while at 409. Later on, Walter White lived in 409 Edgecombe as well. And Alex, for a while, had his apartment was a 2-floor apartment. This is when duplex. Yeah. So he had a really nice situation there. So yeah, I kind of branched off the question, but yes, I do remember reading about in the newspapers how Alex had worked to make it quiet, so that I was thinking more about in Birmingham, but the showcase was in New York, and
at
so
the Polo Grounds.
Yeah. So yeah, and that the last professional baseball game played in the Polo Grounds was a Latino All-Star game.
That's
and
right.
Alex played a role in getting that together too.
Remember that one.
Thanks, Peter. Steve,
Adrian,
wanna
thank
finish
you.
this up, or
Your
you-
book, Cuban Star, is terrific.
Thank you, Peter.
Steve, you want one last question, or?
No, I
got one also.
I broke up with the internet, and then
All
one
right.
thing led to another. I'm sure it was discussed, but I sent out that stupid chat thing before. Stoneham and Pompez, was that discussed at all after the
Yes.
question period? It was,
Yeah.
okay. I'll wait for the tape tomorrow.
All right, we'll finish it up with Carrie. Carrie?
Yeah, so Oscar Estrada played for the Cuban Stars for Pompeii and then went on to play for the St. Louis Browns.
Yes.
Do you have anything on him?
So in terms of more detail, then the movement from the Cuban Stars to the Browns, no. But what I do know is there were Estrada was one of the several players that moved from the early Cuban Stars that Pompez operated into the minor leagues. Estrada actually made it all the way up. And so there are several cases. In fact, Tommy De La Cruz played not with the Cubans Stars team, but actually they called them the Havana Cuban Stars, which was like the feeder team to the New York Cubans. And before he ends up playing for the New York Cubans is when Joe Cambria picks him up and gets him to Albany. And so Tommy De La Cruz never plays in the official Negro leagues, but he's playing actually a level below, excuse me, the Negro leagues, the elite Negro leagues. But he also kind of moves the same route that Estrada did from black baseball into MLB. So yeah, there was a handful of players that Pompez signed, and a lot of this had to do with how the players were then presented to the baseball public. And oftentimes the reasoning was, and I talk about this in Playing America's Game, he's not black, he's Cuban. So therefore it's okay. Well, in many cases, yes, they were black, and yes, they were Cuban, but it was just the way they manipulated the color line.
All right,
Thanks.
one more, Peter, make it quick.
Yes, I had to unmute. Yes, I'll make it quick. Didn't the Cubans play one season in the little field underneath the 59th Street Bridge?
I believe that's
And
right.
if so, did Pompez have much to do with that?
Well, Pompez had him play wherever he can book them a game, especially after Dykeman. They played at Randall's Island as well. So there were a lot of games around New York City, and of course going into the outlying areas like Patterson. And of course now I forget the name of the park in Patterson.
Hinchcliffe.
Yes, Hinchcliffe.
Hinchcliffe Stadium.
Yep. Yeah, and thank you. Yeah, and so they play quite a bit there.
But underneath the 59th Street Bridge.
Cubans, if you give them anything, you can hit a ball around. I mean, it's the same way with Dominicans now, right?
Professor Burgos, first of all, we cannot thank you enough. It was amazing. I don't think a lot of us knew a lot about this, and I'm sure most baseball fans don't. But just a compelling story, and the books I'm sure are great. I have one. I'm going to pick up the other one. But please come back, not even to speak, to join our great crew. And thank you so much. Please give it up.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Thank you.
Really wonderful.
Be a part of us.
We're
Thanks for
blessed
your
tonight,
attention.
no
It
question.
was an enjoyable
Thank you.
conversation.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you again. We'll be together next week with